So it really is a delight to welcome you to Monterey and to help us better understand some lessons from the 2010 NPT-Review conference. And I should say, for those who don't know this, that Ambassador Marschik is the Austrian permanent representative to the Political and Security Committee of the European Union. Sir.
Okay, Bill, well, thank you very much, and thanks all for coming to this rather obscure subject. But of course, it's not obscure here, and that is one thing that I'm always struck by, and it's such an honor for me to sit here next to Bill and hearing Bill say these nice words. Few people outside this the disarmament and non-proliferation community know the extent to which Bill Potter influences the whole non-proliferation, nuclear security, deliberations, and multilateral diplomacy. Most of the negotiators that I recall are actually your students. So many of these conferences end up being extended classroom projects somehow. So so the influence that Bill has on the substance, but also because he knows them so well, on the people who negotiate is substantial, and I think that is an incredible asset that is here for Monterey Institute. And though I unfortunately was not one of your students, I do somehow hope that I was taken on as an intern sometime, or at least accepted as a I don't know what you have, if you have that in your university, someone who sort of listens in, sneaks into the classroom and tries to profit from your wisdom from time to time. I have to say that right at the beginning, you mentioned it. I actually stopped. I was director for Disarmament for 5 years, but I have not been doing that for the past 3 years. I'm now in Brussels representing Austria at the EU. And that, of course, means also that I am not as up to date on what has been happening in the disarmament field in the last 3 years. But for that, I'm also so grateful, Bill, that you are here, because if there's anything that has happened since, and if there's an interest on your part, then Bill can help me out there. I was thinking of focusing on two parts. One is looking back 2010, some of the lessons learned, some of the experience that we had. It was a momentous, something like that is a momentous experience for anyone who does it the first time. For me, it was the first time. As for most delegates, actually, and that is something I think we can also maybe discuss briefly on, with the big exception of you, Bill, who has, I don't know how many PrepCons and RevCons you have already seen. I thought that it would be good to look back, give you some practical insights, and then from what it takes, then just to try to look and see what we can learn from that for the future, for the 2015 RevCon. And again, here also, since, as Bill said, I was dealing with disarmament in my segment of the conference, I think I will also focus mainly on I will draw my experiences also from subsidiary body 1, which was the disarmament negotiation. So that will also be slightly one-sided, perhaps. If we look at the lessons from 2010, it's always good to go right to the end and see, so what did people actually say about the conference and with the result of the conference? And if you go back and look at the media reception, I think that was rather bad, considering that we had just actually revived the NPT after a failure in 2005, and we, the delegates, were exhausted but relieved and content that we actually managed to negotiate a substance. The media was awful. And it was the one thing that remained me, the exasperation of Libran Kabaktalan, the president, who said that they have all got it wrong. They don't understand what it's all about, and we have failed to communicate what this is all about. And that, I think, is one of the big lessons, which I'll briefly touch on later again also, is the fact that for me, the biggest lesson from the whole conference was that from the beginning you have to start with a communication strategy to the outside world. The whole enterprise, the whole disarmament, non-proliferation world is a very closeted world. And if then you come at an intersection with the real world out there, such as at the end of such a conference, if you are not prepared to explain what you have been doing and what you have achieved, it will be impossible to understand and to sell and to explain. So the media was rather the only thing they focused on, if I remember correctly, was this question of why was Israel named and Iran not named. And if you look at it that way, it's a completely incomprehensible fact that it has an incredibly difficult backstory, and if you can only understand it if you understand the NPT and the conference and what was at stake and what was happening in parallel in the Security Council and outside, was that this ended up that way. But it was, of course, not the sole defining narrative of the conference, but that was the way it was received. If you look at what the experts said after the conference, that was much more nuanced. Reaching Critical Will, the NGO coalition, wrote that the outcome was carefully crafted to stay within the red lines of every delegation, and it was the best that could be offered at this point in time. And Deepti Chubi for Carnegie wrote, the 2010 final document could certainly be stronger, but it also could be a lot weaker. It's not the lowest common denominator document. The smartest, as always, was Bill Potter, certain Bill Potter, who...
I'm afraid to see what I wrote.
Yeah, you wrote, I have it here. He said the 2010 review conference demonstrates that the NPT is very much alive, if not yet in full health, and that the basic bargain that made possible its negotiation continues to be highly valued by all states parties. And that's more or less exactly what most experts thought after the end of the conference. The one good thing about it was it kept the NPT alive. And after a failure as we had in 2005, it was important to keep the process going. Process, as you all know, if you study multilateral diplomacy is 90% process, 10% content. Much of what we do as diplomats is process, and repetition of process. And sometimes little nuances change the game, and sometimes developments happen and issues get taken up, and the outside world breaks into the multilateral diplomatic closed circuits. And we end up having to change the process. But much of it is process. And the alternatives to existing multilateral diplomatic processes are fraught with dangers, because especially in the nuclear field, these dangers can be quite significant. So the fact that the NPT remained and the NPT, the forum remained, the obligations remained, the understanding, the big agreement, the big deal among the states was to continue along this path was the big result. If we look at the substance, if we forget about the process, I think there are a couple of things which are in it which are positive. One thing that few commentators remarked, I thought it was quite significant, was that for the first time the NPT member states agreed that a world without nuclear weapons is a goal for the parties of the NPT. That seems maybe something small or minor or unimportant, but in fact, if you go back only half a year prior to the 2010 conference, there was a summit on disarmament and non-proliferation on 24th September 2009, a summit in the Security Council in New York, and they had also negotiated a resolution 1887, and Austria was on the council at the time, and we were adamantly trying to get in a language that would enable us to put this goal, a world without nuclear weapons, into the text, and it was impossible, absolutely impossible to mention that. So only half a year later, the NPT states, which include all the P5, agree on this goal, and also to pursue policies that are fully compatible with this goal. Another first was the mention of the Nuclear Weapons Convention. I hear that is not being pursued as much as it was in the cycle between 2005 and 2010. It was a huge issue. It was very much combated by the P5. Nevertheless, it got mentioned in there, and thereby it was made clear that it's not incompatible with the goals of the NPT. Another first, and this has more relevance today, was that there was a reference to the humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons. This was seen as is seen as an important step towards delegitimizing nuclear weapons and helped the evolution of the humanitarian approach to nuclear disarmament, which is a process which is going underway, and especially in view of the last conference in Nayarit in Mexico on this process, which had raised some concern, especially among the P5, about goals that they consider too ambitious. That in 2010, all P5 accepted the devastating humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons as one of the reasons that we are engaged in this whole exercise in the NPT itself. Two more points maybe that I briefly raise. Action 5, which asks which is also a question of process, but which gets the P5 to talk among themselves on various issues such as security concepts, military doctrine, declaratory policies, and risk of accidental use. The idea being that if you really want to move forward, get the nuclear weapon states to disarm, they're going to have to start talking among themselves, because only if they speak with themselves and if they gain confidence in themselves with each other, will they be able to really start reducing nuclear weapons. At least that's the experience we've gained in the past. There's been only a few small steps in this regard, but there have been meetings, and I understand there's a meeting, we just discussed this before. I think both of us thought that it was yesterday and today in Beijing that the P5 are talking among themselves. So that's small steps, but good steps forward. And the biggest one you mentioned was the format. Not so much a question of content, but a question of format. The fact that for the first time ever, the goals, the provisions of the outcome of the NPT conference were formulated in a way that would enable subsequent monitoring of compliance, and that was the idea being that you could afterwards have brilliant people in the civil society, for example, to use these action plans as a scorecard, and therefore increase the pressure on states in order to comply with the obligations that they subscribed, or the promises that they had undertaken in adopting the final document. And it is good to see that also on a lot of push from the Austrians, the EU has decided that it would report back to the conference using the action plan format. And thereby, with this quasi-legal way that they were drafted very, very specifically as legal obligations in my first draft. That really hasn't, I wasn't able to keep that in all respects. Many of the language was altered in such a way that monitoring has become a bit more difficult during the conference. But initially, the idea was to have a quasi-legal document that could really serve the advocates out there who advocate for nuclear disarmament to hold states responsible to the promises that they had undertaken. Of course, there are huge shortcomings. I mean, the biggest shortcoming was timelines. I had done extensive consultations on timelines. Everybody said that without timelines, everything is useless. But the problem was that consultations showed that the P5 were absolutely not prepared to accept any timelines whatsoever. And my concern at the end was if we force a timeline on them and that timeline would not be held, the consequence would be that the whole document would become less relevant, it would have been broken, it would have been, in a way, it would have lost the value on the other substantive points in there. And we saw that the one timeline the conference really adopted, which was the Middle East conference, to have that conference in 2012, in the end, good as it was to have that there, turned out also to be a liability. Well, once that did not occur, once there was no conference, then of course the result was that the whole compromise, the whole idea to have such a conference itself was called into question. Big shortcoming in my was also the fact that there was no global moratorium on the production of fissile material. There was only one single state opposed to that. That was very disappointing that it was not possible for all the other members of the conference to move one state to change its course there, to change its position there, but it didn't materialize. Yes, and just maybe on some of the other issues on the action plan on non-proliferation, there was a lot of focus on this section on Iran, of course. That was the big issue of the day. There was a strong condemnation, of course, of North Korea. But Iran was difficult. North Korea wasn't taking part in the negotiations. Iran was there. You needed consensus to arrive at a conclusion. You knew that if you sort of pushed Iran over the edge, then by criticizing it too strongly, then you would automatically not come to an outcome, because if consensus is broken by one state, there is no outcome. So you had to find a language that worked. At the same time also, you had a Brazilian-Turkish initiative taking place during, or just before and during the conference, that tried to establish a track for Iran negotiations. And there was also the US, which was pushing sanctions in the UN Security Council at the same time. And all that played in. So the question of how to deal with ensuring the whole compliance issue on the non-proliferation part was a very difficult balancing act. There's some good language on physical protection and illicit trafficking and nuclear terrorism in the non-proliferation part, but I think we also have to face a couple of shortcomings in as much as we had hoped very much going in that the additional protocol would be declared the universal standard, the verification standard for everyone, and that did not happen. And I'm not sure if Robert is here now. The export controls became a big issue. We remember the U.S.-India deal had come just previously and had become a big issue on the question of double standards on export controls, and that took up quite a lot of time in the negotiations. On peaceful use, just very briefly, I think the main issue was the question of should there be multilateral approaches to the fuel issue and multilateralization of the fuel cycle through assurances, through fuel banks or whatever. That had been the big issue in the IAEA, and it had to, even there, those states that would technically benefit from these from these systems and mechanisms, the developing states were very much opposed. Reason was that they saw this was a complex way to actually deprive them of their rights to peaceful use of nuclear energy and to enrich for peaceful purposes. Therefore, this became a big issue, and in fact, it ended up in really becoming a very strong and an enthusiastic affirmation of the right to peaceful use, which a country like Austria, for example, was not at all happy about. But it was part of the deal, and you had to accommodate that in order to ensure that we get tougher language in the non-proliferation parts. And then there was the Middle East WMD free zone decision, which said that there would be a conference in 2012. You know, it didn't take place. There are some careful steps in trying to get a process started to at least take away some of the criticism that's going to come for that in the review conference next time. That is always the difficulty about putting specific dates in there. At the one side, you have a date to actually generate efforts and to generate progress. On the other hand, if the date is not kept, the whole thing gets thrown into a problem, because then you actually have a concrete case of a decision not taking place. Finally, on the process, and here I'm going to try to just give you a very practical outlook, because you can have this looked at from a legal perspective, you can have this looked at from a historian's perspective, social scientists can focus on how the process of the conference went. I'll try to give it to you how it happened for one person who was actually there and had to endure the conference there. And I'll do that in three phases. One was the preparations phase, one was the general negotiations phase, and then you have the final negotiations phase, which sort of is the intense part. Just to give you an idea a little bit about how it works, and then for those of you who will be involved in the conference in 15, maybe some lessons of what to do and what not to do. In the run-up phase, in the preparations phase, there are 3 prepcoms. There's the first one usually takes place now in Vienna, the second in Geneva, and the third in New York, and then you have the conference the following year. In my view, the first 2 prepcoms are a considerable waste of time, frankly. It's a lot of exercise that you put into that, but basically it's a waste of time because you basically rehashing arguments you had the last time. First time that sort of the interpretation of the outcome in the aftermath of the conference. So a lot of the sort of people who left frustrated, and most people left frustrated because you never get what you want in one of these multilateral conferences. You use that to sort of to try to change what you didn't get at the conference, and that's not necessarily positive. And then people are sometimes there that will not actually be there physically in the conference. In our diplomatic life, you change your post every 3 to 4 years. And that means that if you are involved in the first PrepCom, it is likely that 3/4 of the participants in the first PrepCom will not be at the review conference because they will have transferred out. And that, of course, then you discuss things with people who actually will not be there. The third PrepCom is useful because you usually have the people, or at least you will have 3/4 of the people there who will also go to the conference. And it's a good time to agree on the issues, good time to agree on the people who will take up bureau functions, who will be the president. These sorts of issues are good. Much more important in this whole preparatory phase are the informal meetings. And in the lead up to the 2010 conference, we had a lot of informal meetings. And one of the best meetings there are the ANSI meetings, which are organized by CNS. They enable informal discussions. People who go there do not come there to represent the government's position exclusively. Of course they do. Nobody is there to represent just themselves and their point of view. It's not going to be helpful if they do. Nevertheless, they are there in an informal setting. It's Bill who organizes it, Bill who convokes, and then you have the possibility to work with your general government's position, but to also to feel more free to sometimes leave that and maybe test a couple of new ideas. So you get out of the box ideas, some possible alliances with other states who you realize have similar interests. And it also, of course, brings the key players together and thereby establishes a certain degree of trust. And if there's anything I really was struck at the review conference was the extent of mistrust that existed. Mistrust with the system. Everyone constantly thinks that the system is working against oneself. Mistrust between delegations, which I think which is understandable. But even mistrust within delegations, which is interesting, especially the larger the delegations get. There's a lot of concern about whether everyone is following the line or not. And so these informal meetings have a lot to do also simply to build personal relationships, which are then crucial, especially in the final phase of the negotiations. In the preparations, you also make sure that you build the right bureau. The bureau it's like what do you call it? The management of the conference. You have to have a committed and determined president. And I think with Libran Kabaktulan, we had just that. He was not an expert on NPT affairs, He was sometimes a bit difficult in the way that he presented the way he saw the issues at hand. Sometimes a bit difficult to pin down exactly on what he thought. Sometimes he came up with very surprising rulings or positions, and surprising also for us in the bureau that were around him. But he was extremely committed. He went into the conference, he said he would not accept failure, and he would continue working as long as necessary until there was an agreement. And he was very flexible. He was flexible, and that you need someone who is quick on the feet in order to, the situation evolves constantly, and you need people who move quickly. And he was extremely well liked. And that is also, it seems absurd to mention that, but don't underestimate that if you have a room which is hostile against the person in charge, the room will make it a nightmare. But if the room feels and likes the person out there who's very much alone at times, and that you will have people helping you over certain difficulties. So it's wise to choose a president who has a possibility of engendering some sort of sympathy towards him. There was a very dedicated bureau, and I was part of that, so I can't really say that. But you don't need the best experts. You need good negotiators, people who sort of know how multilateral negotiating works. But especially you need people who are prepared to invest almost a year of their life and do nothing really besides that. And that also is not always something you don't always find in diplomacy. Anyway, then the Secretariat. And the Secretariat, that's a big issue because there is no real NPT Secretariat. There is the UN, which helps out. It helps out basically by providing one person. In that case, that was Tom Markram, who's a brilliant person who's had enormous experience in the area, who knows all the issues, he has all the technical experience, and also how these negotiations usually work. And having someone of Tom's stature along was eminently impossible. But the fact that he was more or less alone, I mean, he did have help, and he also had help from other friends, so he had a slightly expanded secretariat. But if anything had happened to Tom during the conference, we would have all been lost. And I think that is a bit of a dangerous way to run things. But it worked, so I presume it's that justifies the way it's set up.
You're bringing him back, by the way, for 2000.
Are they really? Oh, thank God. The more we got to the conference, the more we had to, of course, prepare also in what we wanted the outcome to be. And here I must say, each one of us, I was dealing with disarmament, and there was a colleague who was dealing with non-proliferation, and one who was dealing with peaceful use, and one who was dealing with the Middle East. And we were all quite alone in our preparation. We were left to our own device. We had some contact with the president, who would phone from time to time and ask if everything was working all right, and if we knew what to do. And then who would, when you started asking questions, who would hang up quickly and say that everything looks good and we should just continue. And then there was Tom, you would call and then said, I'm a bit upset. I'm not quite sure. Are we still working on the same thing? And here also, I think that if there's a lesson learned, I think this phase and maybe the last 4 weeks leading up to the conference, I think the Bureau must be much more in touch with one another in order to make sure that we're all following the same goals and also the same strategy and tactics for the conference. So some more central guidance would be good in that phase. So that's the preparation phase. Then we get to the conference itself. And then, again, here I will focus very much on the disarmament part, because I was trying to get an outcome, which is an outcome document on provisions on nuclear disarmament, basically taking nuclear weapons away from the P5. Which is not the easiest sort of task you set out to do. That's it's what I can tell you after this experience is if you want to survive, you have to start out ambitious and seek novel solutions somehow. Something new has to be there. I looked for my first draft, the first draft that I put out, and I couldn't find it. I don't know if it survived anywhere. But it was quite ambitious. In the context of nuclear disarmament, it was quite ambitious. I sent the text, I remember, in the evening and after the first or second week to Librang, to President Kabaktalan, and saying, this is what I intend to distribute tomorrow. Is that what you said? And I didn't hear for hours. So I was getting more and more word, and I was walking home on 3rd Avenue at 1 in the morning, and then I got a text from him, and it said, "You are bald." So, yeah, well. So I said, well, that didn't help him much. So I went home. And I was thinking if this is Librang Kabaktalan is a Filipino, and I was thinking if that had some sort of, maybe I was not aware of some hidden meaning. No, and then I looked at the text again. It said, "You are bold." So it was not. It was anyway. So but it is true. I was, and the reactions were quite intense. I was supported as a hero from the NGO, which is always a bit dangerous if you go in like that. And I also received reminders that I was risking my career, and also received death threats, though in a nice and kind way, but nevertheless. Of course, the idea is if you start ambitious, you know that over the course of the next 2-3 weeks, it's going to be whittled down to something much less. But the bolder you start, the more you will actually be able to retain. The problem is, the bolder you start, nevertheless, you still, of course, lose a significant amount. But you've raised expectations, in particular with civil society. I can tell you, it is physically difficult. One day after the next, to be greeted by an increasingly hostile NGO who are seeing as you're giving away what you set out to do. So you have to take that, and again, you are very much alone, and you end up being the target of the contempt of civil society, because with every new round of every new text that you present, you lose their affection. One of the things that I found very useful was that I took the time to go through all of the speeches that were held at the general segment, all of the statements in this particular disarmament segment, and all the papers that have been distributed before. And I made sure that in my own action plan that I put together, everyone would have something. And I would be able to point if someone came and said, "There's nothing, and we have nothing." I would say, no, look, action 14B, that's you. You have ownership. Look, that's yours. And that worked somehow. Everyone had the feeling. Of course, I sold a couple of issues to multiple people, but it created the feeling that it was a text that many people owned, and that was important, because people then started defending the text. And that is crucial, because you're alone out there with your text, and you will, of course, only read criticism, because you go out with a text and everyone will start complaining, because once anyone says this is actually good, that gets rid of you from the negotiations perspective, and you only the ones who say something negative, something has to be changed. And then in order to keep something, you have to be negative against it to counter those who want to change it. So it's a very negative attitude during these conferences. But anyway, what I also did was I met bilaterally with a lot of delegations, and that is something I should have done much more. It's something you don't have time to when you are there. But really, it's also this question of trust and sort of confidence building. If you know the delegates personally, and if you've listened to them, it becomes much easier. The action, I'm not sure if you even know what it looks like, but my new thing that I came up with was this action plan format, which basically was a way of it was clear there are certain things that you can do in the disarmament, and there's not all that much. It's all out there for years, for decades. There are some things that are possible, and I'm not going to go through all of the things, but it's not, we can't revolutionize nuclear disarmament all the time. It's not novel approaches. But what was novel this time was that it was all rewritten in a way, and it was written in this action plan format where you would have to do something, and if you don't do it, it would become very obvious. So that also was new for the P5. And while in the beginning I was fairly left alone because most of the focus was on the Middle East, this new format brought a lot of attention back and a lot of delegations scurrying back to the disarmament negotiations because this was something they had to address now because something new was out there. But that also enabled us to change some of the language which people have been working on for ages. And finally, the most important part was there was never any drafting. Because if all of those who know multilateral diplomacy, once you have a text in the paper and someone says, could we start drafting? And then you start to paragraph 1, and then they say, well, I don't agree with the third word. And then I do want it, and then can we put it in brackets? And I want the whole paragraph in brackets. And then you never get beyond paragraph 1. You stay on paragraph 1, you never leave it. And so even though I was under very much pressure to start with the drafting, I never started with drafting. I always said, I will take all your suggestions, and tomorrow I will come up with a new text. That was hard work, especially for some of the people who came with me, working with me, because we had to come up with a new text overnight. But we kept control of the process, and it was my text, and I was able to balance things out. So if I had to take away some things from one place, I could balance it out at another place. In the end, you have to land your helicopter somewhere in the middle where you think everyone will be equally unhappy. And that's difficult to reach, and you never really reach it because you always forget sensitivities and the amount of sensitivities, but you have to try to hit the middle spot. And in the end, that's not always possible, but at least you have to be able then to go out with a text. And that is not easy because at that stage of the conference, this was maybe a week before the end, everyone was blocking everything because it becomes one big result. And if anything moves, then something else is in danger of being left behind, and then only some. So every side blocks everything, and you don't really move forward. And then you have to be lucky, and I was extremely lucky because the two delegations that were the most difficult and had prevented us from finishing the text and moving it up. So you move it up from your subsidiary body into the main body, main committee 1, which was the main committee in disarmament. And we were all trapped in our bodies, and I was more or less done. I knew I would not get a better text, but I knew that if we could just agree on the text, we could at least send it up one stage into the main committee. And I noticed that the two delegations that were the most tricky moved to the side of the room to confer, to discuss strategy or whatever. And then to stop the discussions and said, this is the stage, we're not going to move any further. Let us agree to move the text up towards the main committee. Now, there's no objection, there was no objection, and I saw the two delegates running to their seats, and I bang the gavel with an enormous amount of relief. That was that. But that was luck, that was pure luck, and you cannot, of course, replicate that. And my poor colleagues in the other committees who were more or less in the same situation didn't have this lucky combination of two people standing up and leaving their place. So, the thing is that, in fact, now the conference becomes somewhat virtual because at this stage you already have another group, a group of eminent people, the main players group, which chaired by a trusted friend of the conference, meets in the evenings and meets on the sidelines. Nobody really knows who's part of it. The group also varies in the way that who participates. And they discuss sort of where will the compromise be, main points, how does it get together. And now comes an enormously difficult choreography, how to get, while this group is negotiating the tough deals, you nevertheless keep the main body of the conference moving, and without trying to create too much unhappiness, and because some people are not part of the small group. So you have to keep negotiating on texts, but which are not going to be the key texts. Now remember, we were negotiating, this was 2 days before the end, so on a very, very stressful level, and we were to reach this point of negotiation where I suddenly noticed that the important states suddenly become extremely worried and begin waving to me and pointing out and passing me notes which said, no, no, no. And so I suddenly, it took me a while until I realized that we had entered a part of the text which was, while we were speaking, some of the same articles were being discussed in another room in the building by the principals or by the focus group, which was trying to tie together the last knots on this. So then I had to continue the negotiations, but not come to any result, because that result was being negotiated somewhere else. This phase now is the phase, by the way, where the real deals are not only made, but where also the president gets sick. And people start dropping out because they are totally exhausted. And I remember Libran Kabaktulan was walking around with one of those face masks. He looked like a figure from Star Wars, and I'm sure he felt like one too. It was funny now, but it was nerve-wracking then because he was our president, and we weren't sure whether he would be fit enough to chair to the end. The process at this stage becomes very vulnerable because the mood can suddenly shift very quickly. And it is here that I have to say that we had Libran, who wasn't feeling particularly well, but who managed with his flexible chairing to do quite well, get out of a lot of very tricky situations. But also, again, because people liked him, they wanted him to succeed in this stage, and also to overcome a couple. But if we would have had some terrible, serious legal challenges at that stage, that could have unraveled the whole conference. Because it's a bit chaotic in those last few days. It was at that stage 2 days before we did not know whether there would be an outcome. It was unclear whether there would be anything at all to look at. It was at that stage when foreign ministers are called from your delegations in order for the foreign minister to call other foreign ministers. It all boiled down to, we knew there were maybe 5 or 6 states who could still prevent any decision at all, and a lot of lobbying taking place. And then it turned out in the last day, it was literally the last day of the conference, that it would work. And we got the result that we had. We only got it because we agreed that the whole review part would be adopted as the president's document. That was under his authority. It would have been impossible to agree on that, because that more or less was a review of how everyone did in the past 5 years, and of course you'd never agree on that. So that was the one thing. And then we agreed by consensus on the forward-looking action plans. So if you ask me now who gets the points, who gets my points for the best work at the conference, I think Egypt probably was among those who really got what they came for. They came for the Mideast Conference, and I'm not talking about now, but in 2010, at the end of the conference, they got it. And it had been unclear whether that would really work, but they got it. I think the second who would get my points was Tom Markram and the Secretariat, because they just did incredible jobs. And the third one would probably be the Black Cat pub, because they served dinner until 3 a.m., which was saved me. I would have died, I think, of that. But then we came to the end, and this enormous amount of relief, and we are there where we started, which was we had no communication strategy, and we had no people at all who were working on communicating the result. Nobody to explain what had actually happened, nobody to explain why this was good. No press, individual delegations had press conferences lined up. Even the NGOs were too exhausted to go out and do much explaining. And in theory, the UN, it was the UN had offered sort of they have huge resources in the public information department, but even there, I mean, we ended up with a press communique by the Secretary General, a very positive one. But there was again also there nobody really who went out there and who went out and explained what happened. But so if we look at now, why did we end up with the result? I think we had good momentum generally. We had the momentum coming out of Obama's Prague speech still, which was in 2009, so it was 1 year after that. So there was a global political will to achieve some sort of results. We had the interests of P5 especially to keep the NPT alive. Interest of Iran at that stage of not rocking the boat too much because there was possibility of some sort of negotiations taking place, and also the fact that the Security Council was very much looking at sanctions. And the strong interest of Egypt, who was also the chair of the non-aligned movement, and therefore had a lot of influence over the whole position of the NAM in the settlement, and good negotiation atmosphere. So in a way, I guess we were lucky with time and circumstances, and that helped us enormously. I can now very briefly look towards 2015. Just maybe the challenges that we will have, and I think there are two things I think that we will have to face. One is the fact that we didn't have a nuclear weapon-free zone Middle East conference. That's going to be a huge issue for the Arab group. We had a meeting. I'm now a member of the EU PSC, which is like the EU's little security council, and we meet with the Arab League. And it was not only Egypt there, but apart from the peace process, the WMD-free zone, Middle East, was one of the main concerns raised there by the Arab League. And we're going to have to find a way how to deal with that at the next conference, and not only but in advance in the preparation of the conference, so that we don't run into some huge problem. And Egypt, of course, is a factor. We don't really know. Egypt is not the same Egypt as it was in 2010. It's a different Egypt now, a different foreign minister who, of course, a good friend of Bill's and who knows these issues extremely well, who will probably not block everything simply for the case of for blocking it. But nevertheless, you're going to have to find a way how to accommodate Egypt. The second big issue, Ukraine. Ukraine is going to have an enormous impact on how we on the whole question of nuclear disarmament in particular, and frankly, that is where I am particularly worried. I mean, you can draw a lesson from Ukraine, and that lesson could be that if Ukraine had nuclear weapons, all of this would not have happened, and Crimea would still be part of Ukraine. In my view, that is not the correct lesson. I don't think nuclear weapons would have prevented that from happening. I also believe that it would not have been Ukraine it would have not used nuclear weapons in that instance if it happened. But of course we have different aspects as well, because we have, of course, not only the annexation of Crimea, we also have the violation of the Budapest Memorandum, which is basically the assurances by the nuclear powers to Ukraine that they would respect Ukraine territorial integrity. And I think we had an EU emergency council, a foreign ministers' council on Ukraine in March, and French Foreign Minister Fabius was there. And I mean, these councils are, of course, are not public, but I think he has also stated in public what he said there, and that was that he sees a potential disastrous consequence from the Ukraine crisis, primarily because the question now comes is who still trusts the assurances of the nuclear weapon states. And that works not only for negative security assurances, but theoretically also for the promise of allies and those states relying on nuclear umbrella. And these security strategies, how are they impacted? Do you still feel comfortable under a nuclear umbrella if, as it is obvious, nuclear weapon states might not always keep their word? So for Foreign Minister Fabius said that Council was that the danger could be the lesson that only nuclear weapons possession actually really will protect you. And therefore, that is clearly would be the end of the NPT because for obvious reasons. I don't believe they would have to go along with that narrative. I think you can turn that around also and say, well, yes, theoretically the lesson is that everyone needs a nuclear weapon to protect yourself from another state that has nuclear weapons. However, if nobody had nuclear weapons, obviously you wouldn't need them to protect yourself from a nuclear weapon state. And therefore, what the nuclear weapon states now have to do if they want to ensure that not everyone will start getting their own nuclear weapons is precisely to convincingly demonstrate that they will disarm and that there will be a world without nuclear weapons in the future, and that therefore it is not worthwhile getting out and acquiring such a weapon because it's an extremely costly thing, and it is therefore not necessary for everyone to do it because at the end, and look here, we are beginning already with disarming and moving towards the zero nuclear weapon option. So
the interpreters are going to leave soon. So
I am finishing. Right. I'm finishing right here.
Good.
So thank you all for too long. Sorry.